Next guest is Patrick Lawrence, although he typically writes as Patrick L. Smith. He is a writer and columnist, currently foreign affairs columnist for Salon, and a contributing commenter at the Fiscal Times. He is the author of a number of books, including Japan, A Reinterpretation, Time No Longer, Americans After the American Century is another of Patrick Lawrence's books, and he has spent nearly 30 years as a foreign correspondent and columnist as well. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us.
A pleasure, Richard. You're welcome.
Listen, you wrote a piece that I thought was very striking and compelling the other day on the government's authoritarian war on journalism, with an special focus on the weakness of journalism as a guild or a group of affiliated in standing up for themselves. I don't know if I'm summarizing your thesis accurately, but I think I am, that whether it's the Committee to Protect Journalists or just on an informal basis, that journalists have not done a good job of pushing back against the government. In fact, sometimes have gone in the wrong direction. Is that a summary of what you're saying?
Yes, thank you for that. I gathered up three problems that had arisen rather recently. One was a PBS program on the Navy SEALs that I thought was, not too strong a word, rather disgraceful. Another is the State Department's definition of anti-Semitism. They're all disgraceful, what I'm talking about, Richard. The State Department's definition of anti-Semitism, which is plainly intended to protect Israel from critics. And then the third, most recently, the Pentagon's Law of War manual, a 1,200-page document that warns journalists that they can be eligible, they can be designated enemy belligerents, and treated as such. Okay.
And let's start with that, Patrick, if I may just for a second. Let's start with that, because this to me, and then we can get to the conclusion about what journalism as a profession should be doing. But to me, the declaration by any arm of the United States government that a journalist practicing his craft, which seems to be, or her craft, which seems to be so close to the heart of the democratic experiment, can be designated as a hostile belligerent, that seems to me that should be front page news. That should be something that everybody is talking about and that everybody, led by journalists, is pushing back against. Why are we not hearing more about this?
Well, you go right to my point, Richard. These are not isolated cases. In a certain respect, they're new only in their particulars, okay? We've got a problem in the relationship between journalism and power. Okay, that's not new. It goes back a very, very long way, maybe as far as the Spanish-American War. But I chose to do this piece because we are now looking at the accumulated consequences of this. And these institutions, a public broadcaster, the Pentagon and the State Department, are just way, way over the line. My point is that journalists and their organizations are partly, in large measure, I would say, responsible for this because they did a great deal to precipitate this kind of environment. It's our doing, in large measure. And it's because this sort of stuff is not on page one, as you say, where it should be.
And is this because, I mean, some of us are old enough to remember a time when journalists defied their government, not right away necessarily, but defied their government in the reporting on Vietnam or other military matters, defied their White House in coverage of Watergate and so on, and which also, by the way, was a period in history when journalists were held in much higher esteem, according
Richard,
to Gallup.
Your age. Go ahead.
Yes, of course, all the time. I can't hide it. And we're talking to Patrick L. Smith, columnist and journalist. So in those days, journalists were highly respected and seemed much more willing to challenge the government. What happened?
I think a few things. One of them is structural. The other one is kind of a matter of self-awareness among journalists. I think powerful institutions were brought up very short by the Vietnam defeat and Watergate, and recognized then that media, journalists, had to be brought further under control, more in the way of sort of appealing to their patriotic loyalties. This began in the Reagan administration, all right? Now, paralleling this, and I would not, it would be difficult to overestimate the importance of this factor, is the changing ownership, the change in ownership models. We are now talking about corporatized media, okay? My take on corporatized media is very simple. I don't think we can any longer consider it other than technically private. Basically, the U.S. government has, at least functionally, done nothing more than outsourced another prominent American institution. Okay, we can split hairs about ownership models, BBC or whatever at the other end of the spectrum, the People's Daily in China. All right, but look, if corporate media behaves in this fashion when faced with political power, I really don't see any difference between privately owned media functioning as such and what I call government supervised. Government controlled is too strong. We save that for places like Singapore. But
right.
Government supervised, absolutely. So that's going on too, structure.
And that supervision has become easier when we think about the fact that over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen something like 35, I think it was, or so major media companies consolidated down into 6, perhaps less now, mega corporations with diverse economic interests that go beyond simply media. So there are some inbuilt conflicts. But you also talked about PBS and the SEALs. And, of course, PBS is the P in PBS stands for public. And yet, and we'll get to your comments about the SEALs program, but in fact, PBS isn't that increasingly dependent on contributions from corporations and billionaires too, and hasn't that also affected its journalism?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you've got one of my readers pointed out in a comment in the thread at the bottom of the column. Oh, Patrick, government funding for PBS it comes to a very small percentage of the whole. I'm perfectly aware of that, okay? Right. But as you point out, corporate sponsorships, do your listeners think there's no consequence when NPR and PBS list their sponsors as they endlessly do? It's basically advertising, of course. ExxonMobil, the MacArthur Foundation, and so on and so forth. Ford, who knows what all, right?
Koch brothers.
These companies have interests. This entire the public space of this country is just a swamp of conflict of interest. We don't even know how to judge it anymore, right? I just wrote a column the other week about NGOs in Russia. Right, one of them happens to be MacArthur. They just pulled out, and well, they should have. They were doing not nice things, right? They were doing very kind of transgressive things over there. Well, that's the MacArthur Foundation. They sponsor PBS. What do you think they're doing that for? You
well,
think this
and I would just jump in to say.
And
we're talking to writer Patrick L. Smith, and also, I've certainly covered NPR a lot for its miscoverage and misstatement of, let's say, the financial status of Social Security. They've, including, by the way, the much beloved Ira Glass.
Right.
They are not. There's no hesitation there to take a highly ideological, distorted view of something in so-called news programs, objective reporting, as well as commentary, to distort, to tell the American people that Social Security is in financial crisis or whatever it might be, and to omit the idea of, let's say, raising taxes on billionaires to ensure its long-term growth and expansion. So, yes, I think that's very true, and we are of like mind on this. Now, tell us a little bit about this SEALs program, because I didn't see it, and it certainly did sound appalling.
It was, when we were little, Richard, I'll betray my age now in turn. When we were little, surely, or you may very well have sat in front of a TV on Saturday morning and watched this old footage of the war, right? The Pacific Theater and the European Front and all this sort of stuff. A remarkable old black and white coverage. Okay, well, the very sort of honorable record of things. Everybody knows that, right? The PBS began there with the SEALs and their activities prior to D-Day on the Normandy beaches, and then they went over to the island top in the Pacific, leading up to the Japanese surrender, and all that glorious and extremely courageous work, right? Well, that was the start of the story of the Navy SEALs. The other end of the Navy SEALs story, as PBS cast it, was the murder of Osama bin Laden.
Right.
I find that, as a rather strong, somewhat vulgar word, PBS is basically pimping the bravery of World War II Americans to justify a gross breach of international law and everything the SEALs now stand for, which is, as I called it, the late exceptionalist lawlessness of American foreign policy and strategy. It's just so objectionable.
So
they had these guys on there saying the most obscene things. I did use the word obscene.
Sure, of course.
They had a SEAL veteran from the Vietnam period say, well, yes, we had rules of engagement, but in fact, Vietnam was a playground. What? Do your listeners know how that comes over to take the Vietnam conflict? 3 million Vietnamese dead, and who knows how many others walking around to this day maimed and deformed, and call it a playground? We just don't know. We Americans don't know what we sound like anymore.
Right, and this is the public broadcasting system we're talking about here. So this is going out. This does get some funding from all of us, for one thing. So there's the qualitative violation, if you want to call it that, of journalistic practice involved in that kind of quote. And when you and I were young, the SEALs were the brave guys who went, and genuinely brave, who went up to the U-boats when they were in dock and attached the explosives. I mean, really did that sort of thing, as opposed to kind of an assassination squad. I guess, but there's also the reporting, the factual side of it, which is, for example, you mentioned that the SEALs program did not refer at all to Seymour Hersh's reporting or some of the corroborating reports to Hersh's that came out in the New York Times and elsewhere, suggesting that no, this was actually something that had some collaboration from within the Pakistan intelligence services and so on. So they actually misrepresented, as I understand it, the facts of the situation as well.
Yeah, I mean, the real PBS's skirts are showing on that one, surely. Look, Cy Hirsch, who lives and works in your city, wrote a report for the benefit of your listeners, published in the London Review of Books. Cy doesn't seem to be able to publish in the United States anymore, exposing the Osama bin Laden adventure as a stage set.
Right.
It was all set up by Pakistani intelligence, okay, in order to make the Americans look good. And what did we have, a ticker tape parade or something? In my read, the PBS film was made in some measure, possibly in large measure, because of that. The Cy Hirsch report was
as a rebuttal,
as people say now, dissed all over the place,
right.
And then rather gradually corroborated. It's accurate.
Right.
Hirsch has never stepped back from a syllable of it.
Right.
And then it was shuffled into the deep freeze, never to come out again. And now we have this film on PBS. I don't know whether your listeners are familiar with the inner doings of journalistic organizations, but this is how they work. This film was a reply, in my read,
to Hirsch. Yeah,
to Hirsch, without saying so.
We're talking to Patrick L. Smith. We only have about a minute left. That's interesting, and I guess I would say in the minute we have left, you also mentioned the Committee to Protect Journalists. There was a time when there was a certain solidarity in the journalistic profession when Cy Hirsch could count on people to rush to his defense and the defense of his reporting, particularly as it began to be corroborated. Everybody can file a bad report, but his report has been corroborated by multiple other journalists. People are not. Right. But people are not standing up and saying, this guy's one of our own. Let's protect him. We have even this business about being declared potentially hostile belligerents by the U.S. military. Why isn't the journalistic profession standing up as one and saying, and I'm sorry, we only have about 30 seconds, but and saying this has to stop?
Solidarity, the way there's wall-to-wall, the way penguins have solidarity, Richard. Cy Hirsch is one of the very few people, as we say, standing outside the tent urinating in. And
right.
There are very few of them. When somebody like Cy Hirsch raises his voice, it's pure embarrassment for all those who don't. And my final point for your listeners, journalism is in trouble. The reason I wrote that column is because if journalism is in trouble, so are the rest of us. This is everybody's
Absolutely.
problem.
I couldn't summarize it better. Thank you, Patrick L. Smith, Patrick Lawrence, columnist and journalist. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. You're welcome.
I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour.